Have you ever sat at your kitchen table with the television humming in the background, the clock ticking, the tea going cold, and asked yourself, when did everyone stop needing me? When did I become invisible? It's not a dramatic thing. No grand falling out. No slammed doors. Just time and silence. Messages that go unanswered longer than they used to. Holidays that feel more like obligations for others, not celebrations. Phone calls that you wait for only to realize they might not come at all this week or next. You look back and remember when your days were full of children, of responsibilities, of noise and movement and purpose. And now there are moments when you wonder, does anyone really see me anymore? That feeling of being quietly forgotten is one of the deepest kinds of loneliness. Not because you're unloved, but because the world seems to have moved on without you. You are still here, still breathing, still feeling. But it can feel like your presence no longer matters the way it once did. I want to talk about that today, not with pity and not with lectures, but with truth. Because feeling forgotten does not mean you are finished, and being alone doesn't mean you have to be lonely. There are things, small, real, powerful things you can do to stay emotionally strong even in the silence. Even when the phone doesn't ring. Even when the visitors don't come. Let me tell you about Mary. Mary is 76 and lives in a quiet apartment building in a city where her children now only visit once or twice a year. She doesn't blame them, they're busy, she says. Jobs, kids, life. But there was a moment one late evening in winter when she sat by the window, looked out at the dark, and whispered aloud, "Have they forgotten me?" The question haunted her, not because she didn't know the answer, but because it echoed something deeper, a fading sense of identity. Who was she now, if not a mother in the middle of everything? Who was she when no one needed anything from her? That's when she decided to do something that changed her life, not all at once, not loudly, but gently. Mary picked up a notebook and began writing letters. Not to send, just to write. She wrote to her past self, to her children, to God. Sometimes they were only a few lines. Sometimes they were pages long. But in those letters, she began to remember her voice, her thoughts, her value. That simple act became her anchor. Each morning, she'd sit with her pen and reclaim a little more of herself. And though the silence didn't disappear, it stopped feeling so empty. Because she was filling it with herself. Sometimes the first step to emotional strength is just to start talking again, even if only to yourself. Then there's Glenn. He's 82 now, and had stopped driving, stopped gardening, stopped going to church. Not because he couldn't, but because somewhere along the way he convinced himself it didn't matter anymore. That no one would notice if he showed up or not. But one day at the grocery store, a woman about his age passed him and said, "I haven't seen you around in a while. Missed your smile." That moment hit him harder than he expected. Someone had noticed. Someone had missed him. He got in his car the next Sunday and drove to church. He didn't talk much, just sat near the back. But the warmth he felt from familiar nods, the way his name was spoken, it stirred something awake in him. The sense that presence matters, even quiet presence. Glenn didn't need a room full of people. He just needed one reminder that he still belonged somewhere, that his absence left a space, and that his return filled it. You see, we all need connection. But sometimes we wait for it to come to us. And sometimes, especially in these later years, we have to reach toward it gently, courageously, even when we don't feel like it. There's a power in choosing to show up again, not for others, but for you. To step outside, to water the plants, to sit on a bench and smile at a stranger. These small moments, they matter more than we think, because every time you engage with the world, you remind yourself that you are still a part of it. And when you feel forgotten, the most radical thing you can do is to remember yourself. Remember the things that made you laugh. Remember the music that filled your home when your children were little. Remember what it felt like to dance, to bake, to tell stories, to comfort someone else. That person, they're still in you. Maybe they're quieter now. Maybe they've been wrapped in too many layers of sorrow, fatigue, or disappointment. But they're not gone. They're waiting. And the beautiful thing is, you don't need permission to awaken them again. You are allowed to begin again, to create small joys, to be your own reason for smiling even if no one else is watching. Loneliness is real, but it doesn't have to be permanent. There are ways to reconnect with others, with nature, with faith, and most importantly, with yourself. You just have to take the first small step. A word, a walk, a letter, a smile, and maybe, just maybe, through those little actions, the silence will start to shift. Not because the world suddenly remembers you, but because you do. Sometimes when you've spent so much of your life raising children, keeping the home together, making sacrifices without fanfare, you forget how to receive. You forget what it feels like to be tended to, listened to, nurtured, not for what you offer, but simply for who you are. And when the noise of family fades and the busyness disappears, it's easy to confuse quiet with emptiness. But there is a difference between being alone and being abandoned. One holds peace, the other pain. But even in the pain, there's something waiting to bloom. Helen once told me a story. She was 79, widowed for over a decade, and described her home as peaceful but echoey. Her children lived hours away, and though they meant well, visits had become rare. Calls were brief. She used to keep her evenings open just in case one of them called. But more often than not, her nights ended in silence. Then one evening, she reached for her knitting basket instead of her phone. Something she hadn't touched in years. The yarn felt familiar in her hands, like muscle memory returning. She didn't knit for anyone. She just knitted for herself. The movement, the rhythm, the focus, it gave her a quiet comfort, a sense of creating again, of doing something with her hands that didn't need an audience. That was the beginning. After that, Helen joined a small community group at the library, not because she was seeking company, but because she wanted to learn something new. They met once a week, shared coffee and crafts. Slowly, the faces became names, and the names became friendships. Not deep at first, but steady, kind, honest. She told me it wasn't that my children came back. It was that I came back, to myself, to the world, on my own terms. And that perhaps is one of the most powerful things you can do when you feel forgotten. Reconnect to the world in a way that doesn't wait for others to remember you. Because when you choose to engage with life again, at your own pace, in your own way, you stop living in the shadows of other people's availability. Frank, on the other hand, had always been the strong one, the dependable grandfather, the one everyone leaned on. But when his health declined and he could no longer drive, the visits dwindled. The grandchildren were teenagers now, his children busy with work, and Frank, who had once hosted Sunday dinners for a dozen people, found himself eating alone more often than not. He told me I used to sit at the head of the table. Now I'm lucky if I'm invited. That kind of shift hits hard. It's not just about meals, it's about identity, about feeling relevant, included. But Frank, in his quiet way, decided to create something new. He started writing letters to his grandchildren. Not emails, not texts. Real letters. Stories from his youth. Bits of advice. Silly jokes. Sometimes just a few lines. And at first, there were no replies. But he kept writing. One day, a small envelope arrived in his mailbox with shaky handwriting from his youngest granddaughter. Inside was a drawing and a note that said, "I love your stories, Grandpa." Frank cried, holding that paper. Not because he was sad, but because he remembered that connection doesn't always come on our timeline. But it often comes when we give without demanding. There is strength in doing what feeds your soul, even if no one claps. There's beauty in showing up, even when no one else does. And sometimes staying emotionally strong means giving yourself permission to matter again to yourself first. That's what Margaret learned too. She had always been a caretaker. Her husband had passed years ago, but she still carried the habits of caretaking with her, saying yes before thinking, prioritizing others' comfort over her own. But the truth was, no one was asking much of her anymore. And that empty space was loud, so she filled it with old memories. Not just reminiscing, but revisiting passions she had forgotten: her love of watercolor painting, classical music, and walking barefoot in her backyard garden. She began making a little routine: music in the morning, painting after lunch, tea in the afternoon sun. No one told her to do it. No one noticed at first. But Margaret began to notice herself again. Her laughter, her thoughts, her curiosity, and the most amazing part: her children started calling more. Not with needs, but with interest. "What are you working on?" "Mom, can I see your painting?" "That song you played last week." What was it? Something had shifted. It wasn't that she demanded attention. It was that she no longer waited for it to feel whole. You see, people respond to presence. Not loudness, not neediness, but presence, that grounded, peaceful light you carry when you are living for yourself, not waiting to be remembered. You don't have to fade just because others aren't looking. You don't have to pause your joy while waiting for someone else to give it a reason. This is your life, still full, still precious, still unfolding. You are not forgotten, maybe overlooked at times, but never lost. Because as long as you continue to see yourself, to honor your emotions, to choose meaning over silence, you are deeply, fully here. And that matters. There is a quiet kind of strength that grows inside you when you stop waiting for someone else to pull you forward and begin walking again, one small step at a time, on your own. It's not easy, especially when you've poured so much of your love, your identity, your energy into others, into family, into a home that used to be full of voices and footsteps and shared meals. When the house goes quiet, it's natural to feel like something has been taken away. But there's another way to look at it. The quiet isn't only loss, it's also space. Room to breathe, room to create something new. And when you begin living from that space, you start to feel the shift, not just in how you see the world, but in how the world begins to see you again. John is 81 and spent much of his early retirement sitting by the window, watching the world move on without him. The corner cafe he and his wife used to visit had changed hands. The neighbors had moved away. His son lived across the country and rarely called. But something changed the day John decided to stop being a watcher and become a participant again. It started with a walk, just down the street, just to move. Then he walked again the next day, and the next. He started recognizing faces: a woman walking her dog, a young man on a bicycle, a mother with a stroller. And slowly these strangers became nods, then smiles, then brief conversations. And one day someone said, "You always seem so peaceful on your walks. It makes my morning better." John had no idea anyone even noticed him, but they did. When you show up for your own life, others begin to notice. Not because you demand it, but because presence is magnetic. And even in your later years, you can still be the light in someone's day, sometimes just by being yourself. But this kind of emotional strength doesn't come from pretending everything's fine. It comes from building a life that feels meaningful even when no one else is clapping for you. Even when the world isn't paying attention. That's what Eva discovered. After her husband passed, the loneliness was like a fog. Her children had their own families, their own lives. The house that once held so much love now echoed with silence. At first, she filled the space with television puzzles and sleep, but it didn't feel like living. One morning, she sat in the garden with her cup of tea and watched a robin flit from branch to branch. And out loud to no one in particular, she said, "I miss being part of something." She didn't mean a big group. She didn't mean busy social calendars. She meant connection, purpose. She wanted to belong again, so she signed up for a local community class, not because she needed to learn knitting, but because she needed to sit beside someone else, to share a room, a smile, a laugh. She told me I didn't even care if anyone talked to me the first few weeks. I just liked knowing I wasn't the only one figuring it all out again. That was enough to keep showing up, and slowly it became more. She started looking forward to Thursdays, to the rhythm of it, to seeing the same faces, and eventually the conversations grew. She started being invited to coffee afterward, to birthdays, to walks in the park. Ava didn't wait for her life to be handed back to her. She stepped gently into it one Thursday at a time. You don't need to have everything figured out to begin. You just need to begin. With a walk, a class, a phone call, even just sitting outside and smiling at the world as it passes. That smile might change someone else's day, and it might change yours too. And let's talk about this. Sometimes staying emotionally strong means protecting your own energy from people who only remember you when they need something. You don't have to give just to feel useful. You don't have to be the fixer, the free babysitter, the emotional vault for everyone's stress, especially if no one's asking how you're doing. Boundaries don't mean shutting people out. They mean loving yourself enough to stop being drained. When your adult children only call when they need something, you don't have to say yes just to stay connected. You can say not this time, but I'd love to catch up another day. You can offer your presence, your love, without giving more than you can, because your value is not measured in how much you give away. Your value is in who you are. And when you start living like that, when you move through your days with a calm kind of confidence, when you stop waiting to be remembered and start choosing to remember yourself, people feel that. They hear it in your voice. They see it in your eyes. You don't need to chase their attention. You become the kind of person people are drawn to just because you are steady, joyful, real. That's the thing about emotional strength. It's not loud. It doesn't yell. It doesn't plead. It simply stands quietly in its own light. You don't have to be busy to be full. You don't need a crowd to feel loved. You don't need a title or a task or a role to be worthy. You are still here. You are still breathing. And your story is still unfolding. There is joy to be found in these days, not because everything is perfect, but because you are choosing to be present for them. Not because someone called, not because someone showed up, but because you did. If you've made it this far, thank you. Truly. Thank you for sitting with your own feelings as we walked through these stories together. Thank you for staying open even when it hurt a little. And thank you for giving yourself the time and space to be reminded of something so easy to forget you still matter. Not because someone calls you, not because you're useful, not because you've earned it by giving, sacrificing, or staying quiet, but simply because you are. You are still here, still learning, still growing, still able to touch someone's life, even if that life is your own. And if this message stirred something in you, if even one story felt like it reflected a piece of your heart, then I hope you'll share a piece of your story too. I'd love to know, have you ever felt forgotten by the people you love? Have you found ways, quiet, brave ways to stay emotionally strong through it? Write in the comments if you feel moved to. Your words might help someone else feel less alone. You never know who is reading. You never know whose life you might quietly touch just by being honest. And if this message made you feel seen even for a moment, I'd love for us to stay connected. You can click subscribe if you'd like to keep walking this journey together. I promise this space will always be gentle, always honest, and always here to remind you that your heart, your voice, and your presence still matter. You've given so much to others. But now is the time to start giving something beautiful back to yourself. Not because you've run out of time, but because you finally understand how valuable that time is. You don't need to shout to be heard. You don't need to be busy to be seen. You don't need permission to live fully and freely. You are not forgotten. You are not alone. You are not done. You are still here, and your story still matters. Always.